Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's QCDR Measures Workgroup. This webinar will provide an overview of the development, criteria, and evaluation of QCDR measures. During this webinar, CMS will provide information regarding alignment of QCDR measure development with the goals and priorities of the MIPS program, selection of appropriate measure constructs and analytics to align with MIPS scoring, QCDR measure requirements, and tips for successful submission. This presentation will be followed by a Q&A session where attendees will have an opportunity to ask questions via phone and via the Q&A box. And CMS subject matter experts will address as many questions as time allows. You are welcome to submit questions during the presentation or wait to submit your questions until the Q&A portion of the call. Now I will turn it over to Sharday Buchanan at CMS to begin.
Thank you, Olivia. As Olivia already said, we welcome you to the QCDR Measure Development webinar. My name is Sharday Buchanan, and I am the co-lead and subject matter expert at CMS for QCDRs and Qualified Registries. Next slide. Just a reminder that this presentation was prepared as a tool to assist providers and is not intended to grant rights or impose obligations. Next slide. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide an overview of the Qualified Clinical Data Registry measure development process. This will include QCDR measure basics, tips for a successful measure, for a successful submission, measure testing, and additional QCDR measure requirements for the upcoming 2023 self-nomination. In addition, we will be looking ahead to the future of the Merit-Based Incentive Payment System, or MIPS. To wrap up the presentation, we will provide a set of resources available for you to use, as well as hold a question and answer session. We ask that you keep questions focused on QCDR or QCDR measure related items. Any other MIPS related policy questions, etc., will be deferred. For additional MIPS program guidance or additional topics outside of what we cover in the workgroup, we ask that you please refer to the Quality Payment Program Resource Library or submit these questions to the QPP Service Center. I will now turn it over to Marla Throckmorton of the PIMS team to begin our presentation. Next slide.
Thanks, Sharday. Today we're going to be diving into QCDR measures, and when I refer to measures throughout the rest of the presentation, it's understood that it will be a QCDR measure. Next slide, please. So let's go over the high-level QCDR measure timeline. So measure development, review, and posting process. The QCDR will create and or collaborate to develop the measures, which is an ongoing iterative process. And this is the time frame in which a QCDR can request a preview call with CMS to discuss their possible or potential QCDR measure concepts. The next step in this timeline is that CMS will annually publish the QCDR vendor requirements or intermediary requirements, and then the QCDR self-nomination toolkit, which will provide you with a QCDR measure development handbook, applicable fact sheets, as well as a self-nomination user guide that takes you step by step through the QPP self-nomination tool. Next, the QCDR will submit their self-nomination and as well as their potential QCDR measures. The first part of the review process is that CMS will determine if the QCDR itself as an organization is eligible to submit measures on behalf of the clinician group, virtual group, or APM entities. A review process, which is a multi-level review process with different levels of CMS leadership, will occur, and the measures then become approved or rejected for that specific performance period. The next step would be, if it is a rejected measure, the QCDR will have the opportunity to submit edits or updates to their measure to be reconsidered. And this is a great opportunity to provide justification on why the measure should be approved. Then once the final decisions are made, all the approved QCDR measures specification files are then reconciled. Once all those are reconciled, then CMS will publish the entirety of the QCDR measure specification file to the QPP website for public posting. And approximately 15 days, well, not approximately, but according to the rule, within 15 days after that posting occurs, then the QCDR must publicly post their individual QCDR measure specifications to their website. Next slide, please. So some of the requirements are that the QCDR measure should be beyond the measure concept phase of development. That means you have to have data or documentation, testing, etc., that will address significant variation in performance. The measures must be face valid and in alignment with the incremental testing policy stated in the final rule. And we'll go into that a little bit more later. The QCDR measure should also address areas of duplication. We want to avoid duplicative measures, so a thorough environmental scan prior to fully developing and testing the measure. CMS likely won't approve measures that are duplicative or very similar to another measure, such as a QCDR measure or a MIPS clinical quality measure or an electronic clinical quality measure or ECQM. QCDRs are required to collect data prior to the submission of the measure for CMS consideration during the self-nomination period. And CMS does encourage the QCDR to collect data for 12 months prior to submission, which increases the likelihood the QCDR measure then will be able to be benchmarked once it's in the MIPS program itself. And again, as we discussed on the timeline, the QCDR must publicly post the measure specifications for each measure no later than 15 calendar days following approval of these measure specifications. This includes the ID, and then the QCDR must also provide CMS with a link. You can send that information in the self-nomination tool via comment, telling us where the link is and when the information was posted. Next slide, please. So an overview or an update on the QCDR measure testing requirement. So new QCDR measures, at a minimum, must have face validity prior to being self-nominated for the 2023 MIPS performance period, which in turn is the 2025 MIPS payment year. So measures which were approved for any preceding MIPS performance year, or what we call these existing measures, would be required to be fully tested prior to being self-nominated for any subsequent performance period. The caveat to this, the new measure idea, is that to be included in a MIPS value pathway, the QCDR must be fully tested. There is no incremental testing requirement for the MVP. Next slide, please. QCDRs must also be able to link their measures to at least one of the following at the time of self-nomination. So any of these link it to a cost measure, or link it to an improvement activity, or link it to an MVP. If there is not a clear link to one of these three items, then CMS would consider an exception if you're able to show that, for example, there's not a link to a cost measure because the specialty isn't reflected in the cost measures. And then we would review that information and take it into consideration. Next slide, please. So in instances where a QCDR believes that a low reported QCDR measure that did not meet benchmarking thresholds is still important and relevant to a specialist practice, then the QCDR may develop and submit a QCDR measure participation plan for CMS consideration. And a low reported QCDR is defined as a QCDR measure that fails to meet benchmarking thresholds for 2 consecutive performance periods. This means that the data submitted is insufficient in meeting the case minimum and volume thresholds required for benchmarking. Submission of a participation plan does not guarantee the approval of the QCDR measure for the upcoming performance period. An example of what a QCDR measure participation plan could include, it can include something like development of an education and communication plan. The QCDR measure specification could be updated with changes to encourage broader participation, as well as a QCDR could actually require the reporting on that measure as a condition of reporting through their QCDR. Next slide, please. These items are required that a QCDR should be able to collect all data elements required for the measure and be able to feasibly implement those by January 1 of the performance period. QCDR measures are generally approved annually for one performance period, but there is now an opportunity to be approved for a 2-year period with the annual review. CMS may revoke the second year's approval if the approved QCDR measure is topped out or has no variance in the performance data, is duplicative of a more robust measure, reflects an outdated clinical guideline, or it's from a QCDR who is self-nominating and is no longer in good standing. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the measure basics and the process of measure development. So QCDR measures should have a meaningful quality action, which means the numerator. The quality actions are the focus of the quality measure because that's what determines if the eligible clinician is providing good outcomes for their patients. The quality action details the clinical activity expected for the population identified in the denominator. Really, it should be outcome-oriented, that the quality activity should address a health status change resulting from the care, either desirable or adverse, and is not just a process of care. They should resolve areas of duplication with other measures, and a measure must have a quality action with a known variation and gap in performance. And you'll hear this repeated several times throughout the presentation. You should be able to quantify the performance gap and variation in performance to demonstrate that there is room for improvement. Submit the QCDR performance data or cite relevant literature, preferably within the last 5 years. If data is not available, the measure should be evidence-based and should cite current clinical guidelines, again, from that as most recent within 5 years, or recommendations from recent reputable resources. Next slide, please. So each year, the PIMS team and CMS receives hundreds of QCDR measures for review. And so we tried to look at those trends on what is the common feedback that we do have to give. And these are things like measure needs a quality action. 2 measures should be combined, for example. We will walk through a few of these typical scenarios for you to consider to give you a better opportunity for the measure to be approved as a QCDR measure. So the first one is to submit a measure. Do not submit a measure that only captures an assessment or a survey that was completed. This is an example of a process measure. What you do want to do is focus on a robust quality action instead of just being a checkbox or documentation measure. For example, if the numerator is the completion of an assessment or a survey, but then there's no follow-up care or plan to address an abnormal result on that assessment or survey, then it's not considered a true quality outcome, quality action. Again, along those same lines, don't just focus on a clinical process with minimal link to an outcome. Again, focus on outcomes such as an intermediate outcome, patient-reported outcome, etc. Next slide, please. Do not split a single measure into several different measures. For example, Let's say that there is a diagnosis that you should always be doing 3 different tests for to determine if a patient has a condition, for example. It shouldn't be all 3 tests in single measures. These all should be combined into a single measure so that it can be comprehensive. For example, MIPS quality measure number 441, it looks at the optimal control of ischemic vascular disease and includes 4 goals of the care, such as blood pressure control, tobacco status, use of aspirin or other antiplatelet, and then the use of a statin unless contraindicated. So this comprehensive all or none measure is preferred over having 4 individual measures for each component. You can also do this as different strata so that you are then able to give feedback to the clinician that says, you know, you're meeting 3 of these strata consistently, but there's that one that's keeping you from having a high performance score. Do not duplicate existing proposed retired MIPS quality measures. And that means QCDR measures, clinical quality measures, or electronic clinical quality measures. You really want to collaborate with existing measure stewards to cover a broader patient population or clinical setting. Another thing you don't want to do is submit something that is a never event. And this kind of goes back to that unvarying performance. The example that's usually used is a fire in a surgical area. It would happen so infrequently. How would you tell a difference between clinicians? If they had 1 fire, you know, that's really bad. But if you have 0 fires, it's just not enough of a variance. Next slide, please. We don't want the collection of data or the reporting of the quality of the QCDR measure to be burdensome to the MIPS clinician. So really the goal is to find things that work in the workflow and consider existing coding systems to efficiently capture patient population and quality action, and choosing the appropriate collection type for your measure. We don't want the measure to have potential or unintended consequences. For example, we don't want a measure that discourages an oncology patient from receiving oxygen, for example, or other comfort measures at end of life. So you can, a way to mitigate these unintended consequences is to see if there's a need for a denominator exclusion or a denominator exception. We don't want the measure to be a standard of care with the expectation it is performed consistently. Again, this goes back to that performance gap. Investigate opportunities to revise the measure to include a comprehensive and robust quality action. Next slide, please. So, talking about the duplicative concept, during the measure development phase, it is very useful and is expected that a thorough environmental scan for measures that may address the same condition, outcome, or setting. You want to review the existing QCDR measures to identify similarities and differences in clinical concept, quality action, patient population, the clinical care setting, the clinician type, or other such important factors. Addressing areas of duplication reduces burden, improves scientific viability, and increases the measure importance. So what happens if 4 QCDRs have very, very similar measures with 4 different measure IDs? Then that means that that data cannot be aggregated as one large cohort, which would increase the likelihood of benchmark creation. Next slide, please. So what happens if a new QCDR measure duplicates an existing measure? Well, CMS will likely not approve the new duplicative measure and suggest that that QCDR obtain permission to use existing measure that's similar in concept. If CMS does request that one or more QCDR work to address areas of duplication and that request is not completed, then CMS and the contractors will review all similar measures during the self-nomination period and improve the most robust measure. So CMS is looking at a number of different factors, such as not only is it just one quality action more robust than the other, but does the measure cover a broader patient population? Is one measure more intuitive than the other? Those are just examples of things that are taken into account. Under special circumstances, duplicative measures may be approved for one performance period or year, under the condition that the QCDRs involved will address the areas of duplication for the subsequent year's consideration. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, CMS is really moving towards an inclusion of outcome-based measures in the MIPS program. A list of the preferred measure types are presented below. One, an outcome measure, which is a measure that focuses on the health status of a patient or the change in the health status resulting from healthcare, desirable or adverse. The next two really speak, no pun intended, to the patient voice. These are a patient experience of care, which aims to improve the patient experience, such as improving CMS customer experience, supporting innovative approaches to improve quality, accessibility, and affordability. Equity is a very hot topic or a very important focus of CMS. And more importantly, empowering patients and clinicians to make decisions about their health care. Patient-reported outcomes, which are similar to the patient experience, but these usually use some type of PROMIS tool or a PROM, patient-reported outcome tool. The data is collected directly from the patient using that tool, which can be an instrument, a scale, or a single item measure. And then there's an intermediate outcome, which is a measure that assesses the change produced by a healthcare intervention that leads to a long-term outcome. This is essentially a non-outcome measure, but it's closely linked to an outcome of interest. And there must be evidence showing that the measure's intermediate outcome leads to a desired health outcome. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the QCDR measure review process and then tips for a successful submission or self-nomination. Of course, we understand that there are different steps required for self-nomination, such as getting HARP IDs and other things, and those would be addressed in some of the other materials. But today, we're just going to focus on the submission of the QCDR measure. So before submitting the QCDR measures in the QCDR measure web form tab of the self-nomination tool, we ask that you review all measure specification components. And these in their entirety should be submitted at the time of self-nomination. Any performance data, any testing data, anything that you feel like as a QCDR would help CMS make an informed decision on the measure is requested and required. So note that all borrowed measure specification details need to be submitted at the time of self-nomination. With the new web form that we just implemented in 2022 performance period, there is a limited number of fields that have to be filled out because a lot of this information also has to be filled out by the QCDR measure owner. So, for example, testing does not have to be performed by the borrowing QCDR. Be sure to complete a spell check and a grammar check. These specifications are publicly posted, not only on the QPP resource library, but of course also on your individual QCDR websites. And substantive revisions will not be accepted after the close of self-nomination. Revisions at this point are only limited to minor edits, grammar, punctuation, wordsmithing. And due to the nature of the review process for QCDRs and the approval of those during that self-nomination timeframe, additional measures cannot be added after self-nomination closes. And the caveat is that MIPS quality measures can be added for a QCDR to report on. That includes the clinical quality measures, and the ECQMs can be added to your inventory after the self-nomination closes, but not a QCDR measure. Next slide, please. This is something that comes up frequently, and it's who is responsible for submitting the data, or who's actually going to calculate the results of the QCDR measure data score, performance score. So these are options for performance rate submission and data aggregation for QCDR measures that have multiple denominators or patient populations. So if you do submit one performance rate, this means that the QCDR is required to aggregate the performance data prior to the submission of the data. If you're submitting multiple performance rates, so for example, you have 6 performance rates, and you want to say that the overall performance rate, because there's only one performance rate that actually is going to be reported for the measure, you have to indicate how that overall performance rate needs to be calculated, meaning like a weighted or a simple average. So then the responsibility of the QCDR is to submit the measure data at the strata level, and then CMS will aggregate that data and calculate the overall performance rate. The other option, though, is that if you submit an overall performance rate as one of the listed performance rates. So in the scenario that there are 6 performance rates again, and you say that the third performance rate is the overall rate, then that means you submit all the data at the strata level, but then you must aggregate the data for the overall rate prior to submission, meaning you've calculated that third performance rate, which is the overall rate, before you submit the data. Next slide, please. So a QCDR measure must be owned by an approved QCDR, or must be owned or co-owned by an approved QCDR that is active within MIPS for that performance period. And so if a QCDR chooses to become inactive, let's say they just decided not to self-nominate for the next performance period, then the inactive QCDR may transfer that measure ownership or rights to an active MIPS-approved QCDR that it would be able then to self-nominate that measure for the MIPS performance period. The new owner or the receiving QCDR must be able to provide medical and measure expertise to be able to amend or manage the measure. And the way that that is determined is if the QCDR is approved to be a third-party intermediary through this program. The receiving QCDR or new owner could permit other QCDRs to use the measure. So the responsibility of the borrowing QCDR is that you have to have permission from the QCDR measure owner. And that permission must be granted at the time of self-nomination so that the borrowing QCDR can include written proof of permission for CMS review and approval. And that's usually uploaded into that QCDR measure tab in the self-nomination tool. Next slide, please. New measure IDs. So if it's a new measure for the performance period, it's never been approved before, then the vendor should not assign their own measure ID. These are assigned by CMS systematically during the specification approval process. And this allows us to help maintain an inventory and a sequential numbering. But let's say it's an existing measure that had a major change, such as changing from inverse to not inverse, proportional to ratio, might have added a risk adjustment, added a second quality action to the numerator, added denominator exclusions, or it's a newly combined measure then that existing measure becomes, in effect, a new measure and will be assigned a new measure ID, which will also update that performance year to that current year that is being self-nominated as a new ID or a new measure. But that also has possibly considered the downside of not being able to be benchmarked against the previous ID. So it does, in effect, truly become a new measure. Let's move on to the next section, which is QCDR measure testing. I know this is on a lot of people's minds. So what is the role of testing in performance measurement? Well, testing enables the measure developers to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the measure. Testing assesses the reliability, the validity, feasibility, usability, and scientific acceptability, and I don't want to have to repeat those too many times, of QCDR measures to assure they are meaningful measures. Testing is fundamental in reducing the reporting burden, and as you've heard already in this presentation, that is a major focus of CMS and the MIPS program, is reducing that reporting burden on the providers by assuring their effort is not wasted in collecting data on measures that are not feasible or informative. Testing is an iterative process conducted concurrently with the measure specification development. And testing provides the opportunity to refine the draft measure specifications before they are implemented so that they will yield accurate and consistent data for MIPS performance program scoring, and which is, of course, the what is used to determine how one clinician performs as compared to another clinician. Next slide, please. So where does measure testing begin? Well, the first section would be the alpha or the formative testing. This occurs before the detailed or fully detailed specifications are fully developed. This is often during the information gathering of empirical analysis to test for feasibility and measure importance. This is done on a smaller scale and may be conducted multiple times throughout the specification process as refinements are made. This alpha testing also helps determine whether individual data elements are available and whether the form in which they exist is consistent with the intent of the measure. The types of testing done in an alpha test vary widely and often depend on the measure's data source or uniqueness of the measure specifications. Once the alpha testing is completed, then moving on into which there is an overlap, but then there's beta or field testing, which involves a comprehensive and larger scope of testing, which tests the measure specifications actually in real life, I guess you'd say, which is generated during the alpha testing. This is the primary means used to assess whether the measure is scientifically acceptable and is usable. Beta testing may evaluate the measure's suitability for risk adjustment or stratification and further expands previous importance and feasibility evaluations. So a carefully planned and well-executed beta test helps to establish then the evaluation criteria of later measure performance. Next slide, please. So moving on into testing for measure reliability or precision. This evaluates whether the measured data elements that are extracted over time produce the same results a high proportion of the time when assessed in the same population in the same time period, and or that the measure score is precise. In other words, it refers to reproducibility of the same result from repeated measurement. A lack of precision demonstrates random error within a measure. And of course, this is not what the aim is. Conceptually, reliability is the measure of the ratio between signal to noise. So signal is when the variability in a measure is due to true differences in the performance. Noise is then the proportion of variability in the measure performance that's due to measurement error, measurement construct, or the way the measure specifications are written. Reliable list of an example of reliability tests are inter-rater or intra-rater reliability, internal consistency for multi-item test or surveys, or test-retest for survey items, for example. Next slide, please. So measure validity. This measures or determines whether the measure accurately represents the concept being evaluated, and does it achieve the purpose for which it is intended? Does it measure the quality action? Does it actually measure the quality action? It's often appropriate to obtain stakeholder input at several points during the testing process, which also includes this face validity inputs at alpha testing, feasibility and burden inputs at beta testing, and other inputs based on a review of overall results. For example, we want the QCDR measure to clearly identify the concept being evaluated, for example, face validity. And then we want construct validity, which means that all necessary data sources or data elements, codes, tables, etc., to detect a positive occurrence when one exists. Next slide, please. A little bit deeper dive into the face validity testing. I know early on we discussed that all new, just a moment, please. Sorry about that. So all new QCDR measures one moment. It's that time of year. So face validity is required for all new QCDR measures. And this is a subjective assessment by experts. It shows the extent to which a measure appears to reflect what is supposed to measure at face value. Why is it important? It determines whether the measure reflects its intended assessment. So face validity should be completed by a systematic and transparent process that is carefully documented. The National Quality Forum allows the use of face validity in lieu of empirical testing for new measures if a systematic assessment is performed and targeted to reflect accuracy of the targeted care measured. Next slide, please. Of course, there are obstacles for validation. If the measure has extremely complex specifications, it might make the measure more susceptible to the way the different data fields are interpreted by different users. Small errors in the specifications, such as the omission of codes for commonly documented concepts in a value set, can reduce the capture of appropriate patients. Users may enter information into specified measure fields other than those from which the vendor extracts data for measure reporting. And this is part of that workflow and clinical burden that we talked about. You know, a clinician may be documenting the quality action, but because it's not in the correct field, then it doesn't get captured, and then the clinician doesn't get credit for doing the care. So those threats, what happens with these obstacles is that threats can include things like a patient is excluded from measurement. There becomes a difference in patient mix for outcome and resource use measures. Measure scores are generated with multiple data sources, methods, multiple measure specifications. Therefore, it's not reliable. And there could be missing data and non-response. Next slide, please. Feasibility. This is ideally performed very early in the development process. After identification of the required data for measure calculation and before you finalize the specification is when feasibility should be determined. Goals of feasibility is to determine the extent to which required data is available and retrievable without undue burden. And it's the extent to which the developers can collect data and process it for performance measurement. Information can be obtained various ways, such as using systematic surveys or conducting focus groups. Next slide, please. So our testing information, the foundation of all the testing information presented in this slide deck was from the CMS blueprint. But of course, this is very closely aligned with NQF, or the National Quality Forum. I'm so sorry. From the NQF perspective, to evaluate scientific acceptability of a measure, the measure must be both reliable and valid. Although for new measures, again, demonstration of face validity of measure score as an indicator of quality also is allowed. And this is what I believe helped drive CMS's decision to allow for that incremental testing, which allowed face validity as a minimum for all new measures. NQF is not prescriptive about how empirical measure testing is done. Similarly, it does not set minimum thresholds for the reliability or validity testing results. NQF allows testing at either the data element level, using patient-level data, or at the performance measure score level, using data that have been aggregated across providers. When evaluating measure testing results, the method of testing, the data used for the testing, such as a sample, and the results of the testing all must be considered when determining if the measure is ready to be put into place. Well, let's look ahead. I think you can see a pattern here. I'm so sorry. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. As you can see, there's a trend here, and it's really about reducing clinician burden. And so CMS is focusing on measures that reduce reporting burden for the eligible clinicians, such as using measures that can collect data from administrative claims, or the new digital quality measures. ECQMs, or electronic clinical quality measures, are a subset of digital quality measures. But the idea with the digital quality measures is that they are truly interoperable across different systems. And what they're using for this is the new integration of the new data interoperability model, which is the FAST Healthcare Interoperability Resources, FHIR, or pronounced FHIR data model. CMS is also wanting to align measures across programs where appropriate, such as emphasizing utilizations of measures included in the core quality measures collaborative, and emphasizing implementation of those quality measures that align or are similar across programs. Next slide, please. Transition to the MIPS value pathway. And in 2023 performance period, we now have the opportunity for the QCDR measures to be a part of an MVP. The goal of the MVP was to move away from siloed reporting by offering limited, connected, complementary sets of measures and activities across all 4 of the MIPS performance categories, not just the quality measure category. And these categories are meaningful to a clinician's practice, specialty, or public health priority. This will result in comparative performance data that is valuable to patients and caregivers in evaluating clinician performance and making decisions about their care. And that has to do about patient voice and being able to make informed decisions. This also will reduce, the MVP will also move towards a reduction in selection and reporting burden. So what will the impact be on this transition to MVPs on QCDR measures? QCDR measures will be reviewed as a component of a comprehensive package. The questions asked are, does the QCDR measure align with a current or future MVP topic? Does the measure complement improvement activities and cost measures? Does the QCDR measure align with the goal of keeping MVP stable year over year? For example, we would not want an extremely high performing QCDR measure that is topped out, because then it will be would not be able to be stable year over year, such as not meeting the rejection criteria soon after it was implemented. This impact will hopefully also create a streamlined approach to MIPS reporting. Next slide, please. So for a QCDR measure to be included in an MVP, it must be fully tested at the clinician level. Again, the minimum of face validity is not applicable in this situation. The measure must be reliable, feasible, and valid, so as not to inadvertently cause a clinician or group an issue with submission, calculation, and scoring of a given measure. CMS needs to receive the QCDR measure testing data for review by the end of the self-nomination period, which ends on September 1st, to be eligible for proposal within an MVP. It does go through this rulemaking process. You must self-nominate as a QCDR. Again, you have to be an active QCDR that's approved to be able to submit the QCDR measures for CMS consideration within that 60-day self-nomination period that begins on July 1 of the calendar year prior to the applicable performance period, and then will end again 90 days on September 1 of the same year. So a QCDR measure must be approved in the previous year before they can be considered for inclusion with a candidate MVP in the subsequent year. Newly finalized for the 2021 performance period, so 2 years ago, QCDR measures included in MVPs and finalized through the notice and comment rulemaking would be eligible for a 2-year QCDR measure approval. And that is also to support that idea of stability of the MVPs. Next slide, please. I'm now going to turn over the presentation to Olga Kogan to discuss our resources and ways to find the information that we've discussed today.
Thanks, Marla. Hi, everyone. We are going to take a look at some of the resources that are available to you. One of those resources, and something that we do strongly encourage the QCDRs to take advantage of, is a QCDR measure concept preview call. This is a meeting that allows you to get initial feedback on your new measure concepts prior to the start of the self-nomination. We will be holding the preview calls from February 21st through June 3rd. To request a meeting, we ask that you email QCDR vendor support@gdit.com and include multiple dates of availability over a 2-week period. Please also include names and email addresses of those you would like to attend, and we ask that at least 1 week prior to your call that you send us a single Word or Excel document with all of the measures to be reviewed. This will enable the PIMS team to do a review of your measure concepts prior to the scheduled call and provide meaningful feedback during the call. The last day to request a preview call is May 20th. A few things to note about these calls: we do not make decisions on the measures during the calls, since we only have information regarding your specific measure at that time and are unaware of measures that may be submitted during self-nomination that may have a similar topic to yours. We do have limited time, so we will prioritize to give QCDRs a preview call and will not have the opportunity to offer multiple calls unless under specific circumstances. So again, I just want to emphasize that we do strongly encourage QCDRs to take advantage of this opportunity. It is a great way to get that initial feedback on your measures. Next slide, please. Here we have 2 essential resources that we strongly recommend you utilize. This first resource is the 2022 Final Rule. This is where you can read through policies that have been finalized. It is a very large document. One suggestion is to navigate to the third-party intermediary section, or you can search the document using certain terms. For example, QCDR is a good term to use. You can go through and find specific rule language on what is required for the QCDRs. Another great resource is the blueprint for the CMS Measures Management System. The most recent is version 17, and this outlines measure development, implementation, and maintenance. And it also contains links to other supplemental materials that provide additional detail on certain topics. Next slide, please. Several other helpful resources include the National Quality Forum Measure Evaluation Criteria. This contains measure evaluation criteria as well as additional guidance for evaluating measures based on that criteria. The Measure Development Plan and Annual Reports found on the cms.gov website. The Measure Management System. This has great tools and resources that you can access. You can also navigate from here directly to the Quality Payment Program, where there's a resource library as well as a webinar library with tons of valuable information. The 2022 QCDR measure specification file is publicly posted on the Quality Payment Program website, and this gives you a list of all the QCDR measures that were approved for the 2022 performance period. So again, another great resource. Next slide, please. Lastly, we have several resources to support the electronic clinical quality improvement. Here you can find education, videos, tools, and other helpful information. Next slide, please. So that concludes the resources section. I'm going to turn it over to the question and answer portion of the call.
Thanks so much. We're now going to start the Q&A portion of the webinar. You can ask questions via the Q&A box or through the webinar audio. To ask a question via the webinar audio, please raise your hand and we will unmute your line so that you can speak. To submit a question anonymously through the Q&A box, please click Send Anonymously. Otherwise, all attendees will be able to view your question. And we'll go ahead and get started with a couple of questions that have come in through our Q&A box. So the first question asks, CMS had noted that they would consider a delay because of the COVID pandemic for the 2023 performance year in the final rule. And I think this participant is just asking for some clarification on that point.
Yes, in the final rule, there is a statement, and I think really all we can say at this point is that you can read the final rule section and wait to hear what once the preliminary rule is published this summer.
Great, thank you. And we had one other question in the Q&A box, and this participant asked, what is the CMS definition of fully tested for a QCDR measure?
Hi, this is Olga from PIMS. So fully tested means at the clinician level, meaning it's feasible, it's scientifically acceptable, reliable, and valid at the implementation level. We don't have specific thresholds for testing. It's really up to the discretion of the measure steward to ensure their testing data is sufficient to show the measure is in fact feasible, reliable, and valid. We encourage you to utilize the blueprint for any further guidance.
Great, thank you so much for that clarification. Those were the questions from our Q&A box, and now we're going to turn over to the phone line. If anyone does have a question they would like to answer live on the phone line, please go ahead and raise your hand, and I will be happy to unmute you so that you can speak. But while folks are getting their hands raised, we can go back to the Q&A box. We've got a couple more questions in there. The first participant asked, can small practices still send in codes via claims? And if so, where is the most up-to-date list?
We don't have the subject matter experts from the other programs present. You can place your question in the ServiceNow. I'm not using the correct terminology for it, but you can place a question in the ServiceNow help desk, and it can be directed to the correct parties.
Great, thanks so much for that information. I don't see anyone on the phone with their hands raised, and there is just one more question in the Q&A box, and this is a clarification question about what is ServiceNow, so how to submit those tickets.
Olga, was that listed on our resources?
Hi, sorry, this is
Hi,
Colleen
it's
from
Olga. So if you need to submit a question, you can do it by email at qpp@cms.hhs.gov, and then it will be redirected to the correct subject matter expert. Another option for any questions that are related to QCDR, you could always email the QCDR vendor support at gdit.com.
Great, thank you for that information.
Just to clarify, when Marla said ServiceNow, she was referring to the quality payment program where you can submit questions.
Great, thank you. That was a very helpful clarification. And it does appear that those are all of the questions that have come in through our Q&A box. And I don't see any hands raised on the line, but I'll give everyone just one more moment to either type in their questions or raise their hands before we conclude the Q&A. And there was a request for that email address we just gave to be repeated. So are you able to repeat that ServiceNow email address?
So to contact the Quality Payment Program Service Center, there is a email which is qpp@cms.hhs.gov, and I can also throw it in the chat. There's also a phone number, and I can throw that in the chat as well.
Great, thank you so much. Well, with that, I think that concludes the Q&A portion of this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and I'll turn it back over to Sharday Buchanan to conclude the call.
Thanks, Olivia. Just echoing what Olivia said, thanks again for joining the 2022 QCDR Measure Workgroup, and have a great day. Thank you.